She was a widow with nothing but a leaking roof, an orphan boy, and a rifle she barely knew how to use. He was a wanted man with blood on his hands and a bounty on his head. When the deadliest blizzard in Colorado history forced them together, neither expected to survive the night. But what happened next would change everything they believed about love, redemption, and second chances. This is the story of how a monster learned to be a man and how a broken woman learned to trust again. Stay with me until the end, because the twist in Chapter 6 will leave you speechless. This story reminds us of a powerful truth. It does not matter what you have done or where you have been. What matters is what you choose to do next. Everyone deserves a chance at redemption. Everyone deserves to be seen for who they are becoming, not who they used to be. And sometimes the greatest love stories begin in the darkest storms. Storm's Promise is about finding home in unexpected places. It is about two wounded souls who thought they were beyond saving, discovering that together they could build something beautiful from the wreckage of their pasts. It teaches us that strength is not about standing alone. True strength is having the courage to let someone in. If this story touched your heart, do me a small favor. Hit that like button so more people can find this channel. Drop a comment telling me your favorite moment. Was it when Silas saved Clara from the snow? Or when she stood up to the bounty hunter for him? The rifle felt heavier than Clara remembered, or maybe her arms had grown weaker after 3 months alone. The knock came again, hard enough to rattle the whole cabin, and she raised the barrel toward the door. Outside, the Colorado wind howled like a wounded animal, carrying with it the kind of cold that seeped through wool and leather and settled deep into the bones. Clara Whitmore had survived plenty of storms in her 24 years on this earth. She had survived losing her parents to cholera when she was 16. She had survived being sold like livestock by her aunt and uncle to a man 3 times her age. She had survived 3 years of marriage to Thomas Whitmore, a man who touched her like she was a ledger to be balanced rather than a woman to be loved. But she was not sure she would survive this night. The fire in the hearth had dwindled to embers casting dancing shadows across the rough-hewn walls. In the small room off the kitchen, 12-year-old Jake Hartley slept fitfully, his cough rattling through the thin door. The boy was not hers by blood. He was the orphaned son of Thomas's former ranch hand, a man who had died mending fences last spring. Clara had taken Jake in without hesitation, even though she had nothing to give him but a roof that leaked and meals that grew thinner by the week. The knock came a 3rd time. Clara's eyes darted to the cellar door in the corner. Down there, hidden in an old flour sack, was $500 in cash, Thomas's money. She had found it a week after they lowered him into the frozen ground behind the church in Silver Creek. She did not know where it came from, and some part of her did not want to know. "Who is there?" Her voice came out stronger than she felt. A pause. Then a voice so deep it seemed to rumble up from the earth itself. "Name is Silas Maddox. I am not looking for trouble, ma'am, just shelter from the storm." Clara's arms ached from holding the rifle steady. She did not move toward the door. A woman alone did not invite unknown men into her home, not unless she wanted to end up another cautionary tale the townsfolk whispered about over Sunday dinner. There is a town 5 miles east. They have a hotel. 5 miles might as well be 50 in this weather. His voice carried a weariness that matched her own. "My horse is about done. I have got money. I can pay for a spot in your barn." She should say no. Every instinct born of hard experience screamed at her to send this stranger away. But then she heard Jake coughing in the other room, a wet, rattling sound that had been getting worse all week. She could not afford a doctor. She could barely afford food. And if she sent this man away to die in the snow, she would have that on her conscience along with everything else. Step back from the door. "I am armed." "Yes, ma'am." She heard his boots scrape against the wooden planks as he moved. Clara took a breath, then another, and unlatched the door. The wind hit her first, a wall of frozen air that stole her breath. And then she saw him. The man standing on her porch was the largest human being Clara had ever encountered. He had to be at least 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders so broad they seemed to block out the storm behind him. His face was half hidden by a battered hat and several days' worth of dark stubble. But she could see his eyes, even in the dim light spilling from the cabin. They were gray as storm clouds, watching her with careful stillness. He was covered in snow, his coat frosted white. Behind him stood a horse that looked nearly as exhausted as he did. Steam rose from the animal's flanks in the bitter air. Clara kept the rifle trained on his chest. At this distance, she could not miss, even if her hands were shaking. "You are smaller than I expected." His breath formed clouds between them. "The way you were talking through that door, I thought you might be 6 feet tall with a beard." Despite everything, Clara felt her lips twitch. "I am tall enough to pull this trigger." "Yes, ma'am, I do not doubt it." He held up his hands, showing her they were empty. Massive hands, she noticed. Everything about him was massive. "I meant what I said. I am not looking to cause any harm. Just need to get my horse out of this storm. Come morning, I will be on my way." Clara studied him for a long moment. The snow was already coating her hair, melting against her skin. Her judgment of men had never been reliable. She had trusted Thomas because he seemed safe, and she had spent 3 years in a marriage that felt more like a prison than a partnership. But this man was not asking for her trust. He was asking for her barn. "The barn is around back. There is hay in the loft. You can stable your horse there." Something shifted in his storm-gray eyes. Gratitude, maybe. Or surprise. "Thank you, ma'am. I am in your debt. It is Mrs. Whitmore. And you can pay your debt in the morning when you leave." He nodded once, then turned to lead his horse around the cabin. Clara watched him go, his massive frame disappearing into the swirling white, and wondered if she had just made the best decision of her life or the worst. She did not sleep that night. She sat in the chair by the window with the rifle across her lap, watching the snow pile higher against the fence posts. Every creak of the cabin made her flinch. Every gust of wind made her strain to hear footsteps on the porch. But the stranger did not come. When the first gray light of dawn began to seep through the clouds, Clara realized the storm had finally stopped. The world outside her window was transformed, buried under drifts of snow that reached as high as her waist. The sun was trying to break through, glinting off the white landscape with a brightness that hurt her eyes. She needed to check on the animals. The chickens would need feed, and she should make sure the stranger had not frozen to death in her barn. She told herself it was practical concern, not curiosity, that made her want to see him again. Clara dressed quickly, layering every piece of clothing she owned. Her boots were more holes than leather, but they were all she had. She pulled her threadbare shawl tight around her shoulders and stepped out onto the porch. The cold hit her like a fist to the chest. She gasped, her lungs burning, and pushed forward into the snow. The walk to the barn was only 50 yards, but in snow this deep, it might as well have been a mile. Clara was halfway there before she realized her mistake. Her legs were screaming, her lungs burning. The cold had seeped through her boots within seconds, and she could no longer feel her toes. She pressed forward, determined, but each step became harder than the last. 10 yards from the barn, her foot caught on something buried in the snow. She went down hard, the impact driving the air from her lungs. The world tilted and spun, and suddenly she could not remember which way was up. Clara tried to push herself to her feet, but her arms would not cooperate. The cold was doing something to her now, making her thoughts sluggish and slow. How strange, she thought distantly. The snow did not feel cold anymore. It actually felt quite warm, like a blanket wrapping around her, inviting her to close her eyes and rest. A small voice in the back of her mind screamed that this was wrong, that this warmth was a lie, that if she closed her eyes, she might never open them again. But she was so tired. She had been tired for so long. Her eyes fluttered closed. And then something seized her. Clara was lifted from the snow as if she weighed nothing at all, pulled against something solid and warm. She heard a voice, deep and urgent, but the words did not make sense. Everything was blurring together, the white of the snow, the gray of the sky, the dark shape looming over her. Heat surrounded her. Not the false warmth of the cold, but real heat radiating from the body that held her. She was being carried, she realized dimly. Carried like a child, cradled against a chest so broad it seemed to encompass her entirely. The stranger, the giant from the storm. Clara wanted to tell him to put her down, that she did not need his help, that she had been taking care of herself for 3 months and she could manage a walk to her own barn. But the words would not form, and the warmth was too inviting. Somewhere in the distance, she heard a door slam shut against the wind. And then there was only darkness. Silas had killed men, beat them until they never walked right again. But his hands had never shaken like this. Not until he was pulling frozen boots off a dying woman. She was so small. That was the thought that kept circling through his mind as he worked. So small and so cold, her lips turning blue, her skin pale as the snow he had just dragged her from. He had seen plenty of death in his 36 years, had caused more than his share of it. But the thought of this woman, this fierce little widow who had pointed a rifle at him like she meant business, dying because she tried to walk 50 yards in weather that would kill a grown man. It made something twist in his chest that he did not have a name for. He had carried her into the barn because it was closer than the cabin, and he did not know if she had minutes or seconds. The small stove in the corner was still burning from the night before. He had kept it going, partly for his horse, and partly because he did not trust that he would not freeze to death himself. Now he was glad for the warmth. "Do not die on me." He muttered the words as he peeled off her soaked stockings, trying not to think about how improper this was. Her feet were small and delicate, the toes already tinged with the white of frostbite. You did not survive a Colorado winter alone just to die walking to your own barn. He rubbed her feet between his palms, trying to work circulation back into the frozen flesh. His hands were enormous compared to hers, calloused and scarred from years of hard labor and harder violence. Hands that had done terrible things. Hands that had broken bones and drawn blood. Now those same hands were trying to save a life. It felt like some kind of sick joke. Like God or fate or whatever cruel force ran this world was testing him. Seeing if the monster could pretend to be a man. Her eyes fluttered open. Silas went still, watching as consciousness slowly returned to her face. Her eyes were blue, he realized, the color of a summer sky over the plains. For a moment they were unfocused, confused. Then they locked on him, and he saw the fear flash through them. She tried to push him away, weak hands shoving at his chest. "Do not touch me." Silas backed off immediately, raising his hands where she could see them. "Ma'am, if I had not touched you, you would have frozen to death. But now that you are awake, I will keep my hands where you can see them." She was breathing hard, her whole body trembling. Whether from cold or fear, he could not tell. Her eyes darted around the barn, taking in her surroundings, the hay, the stove. His horse watching from its stall with disinterested brown eyes. "My boots," she said. Her voice was stronger than he expected. "Where are my boots? Over there?" He nodded toward the corner where he had set them to dry. "You should not have been out in weather like that. Not in boots that are more holes than leather." She glared at him. "I needed to check on the animals. Your chickens are fine. I fed them this morning." Something flickered across her face. Surprise, maybe, or suspicion. "Why would you do that?" Silas shrugged his massive shoulders. "Figured it was the least I could do. You gave me shelter when you did not have to." She was quiet for a moment, still watching him with those sky-blue eyes. He wondered what she saw. A threat, probably. A dangerous stranger too big and too rough to be trusted. He could not blame her for that. He was all of those things, and worse. "You are bigger than you looked last night." He felt his lips twitch. Hard to tell through a door in a blizzard. She did not smile, but some of the tension left her shoulders. How long was I out there? I do not know. I heard something hit the ground outside the barn, came out and found you face down in a drift. He paused. You were dying, Mrs. Whitmore. Another few minutes, and I would have been digging you a grave instead of taking off your boots. The bluntness of it seemed to shock her. Thomas, her late husband, had probably wrapped everything in polite words. This man spoke like someone who had never learned the art of pretty lies. I just fell. You fell because you should not have been out there alone. He kept his voice flat, stating facts rather than judgments. Storm like last night, cold like this morning. And you are walking through waist-deep snow in boots that cannot keep out water, let alone ice. Heat rose to her cheeks, and he knew it had nothing to do with returning circulation. I know what I need. The words came out sharper than she probably intended. Silas looked at her for a long moment. This close, he could see the dark circles under her eyes, the gauntness of her cheeks. She was not just cold. She was exhausted, underfed, running on nothing but stubbornness and desperation. He knew that feeling. He had been living it for 10 years. I know you do. He kept his voice quiet. I am not trying to tell you your business, just making observations. Well, keep your observations to yourself. The corner of his mouth twitched. Definitely a smile this time. Yes, ma'am. The barn door banged open, and they both turned to see a boy standing in the doorway. He was maybe 12, skinny as a rail, with sandy hair and wide brown eyes. He was staring at Silas like he had never seen anything so big in his life. Ma? The boy's voice cracked with fear. Are you all right? Clara pushed herself up from the hay, wincing. I am fine, Jake. I just fell in the snow. The boy's eyes never left Silas. Who is he? This is Mr. Maddox. He sought shelter from the storm last night. Jake edged closer, keeping a careful distance from Silas. He could not blame the kid. Silas knew what he looked like. A mountain of a man with scarred hands and a face that had seen too much violence to ever look truly kind. But then the boy surprised him. Are you a bad man? The question hit Silas like a punch to the gut. He had been asked that before, usually by people who already knew the answer. But never by a child. Never by someone who genuinely wanted to know. He found himself kneeling, bringing his massive frame down to the boy's eye level. The movement was instinctive, something he had not done in years. Used to be. The words came out before he could stop them. But I am trying to be better. Jake studied him with the unfiltered honesty of childhood. Then he nodded, apparently satisfied. Ma says everybody deserves a chance to be better. Even people who did bad things. Silas looked at Clara. She was watching the exchange with an expression he could not read. Something had shifted in her eyes when he knelt to talk to her boy. Something that looked almost like hope. Your ma sounds like a wise woman. Jake grinned. She is the smartest person I know. Clara cleared her throat. Jake, go back to the cabin and put more wood on the fire. I will be along in a minute. Yes, ma'am. The boy hesitated, then looked at Silas. Are you staying for breakfast? Silas opened his mouth to say no, that he would be on his way as soon as the snow cleared enough to ride. But Clara spoke first. We will see. Jake nodded and ran back out into the snow, moving with the boundless energy of youth. Silas watched him go, something aching in his chest. He is a good boy. He is not mine. Clara's voice was matter-of-fact. His father worked for my husband, died last spring. I took him in because there was no one else. Silas stood, towering over her once more. That is a kind thing to do. It is the right thing to do. He nodded slowly. Not everyone sees a difference between the two. Clara looked at him for a long moment. Then she held out her hand. Help me up. Silas stared at her outstretched hand. It was small and pale, the fingers' work roughened but still delicate. He thought about his own hands, the blood they had spilled, the lives they had ended. He took her hand anyway. Her fingers were cold against his palm, swallowed up by his massive grip. He pulled her to her feet gently, so gently, terrified that he might break her without meaning to. She did not flinch, did not pull away, just looked up at him with those sky-blue eyes and said, "Breakfast is in an hour. You can join us if you like." Then she pulled her hand free and walked toward the cabin, leaving Silas standing alone in the barn with a feeling in his chest that he had not felt in years. It felt dangerously like hope. That night, after Clara and Jake had gone to sleep, Silas sat in the barn with his back against a hay bale and his eyes on the cabin window. The lamp was still burning inside. Clara had forgotten to put it out, or maybe she had left it on purpose, a small beacon of warmth in the frozen darkness. He should leave, he knew that. The storm had passed. The roads would be clear enough to ride by morning. He had no business staying here, inserting himself into the life of a widow and an orphan boy. He was a wanted man, a killer, a monster dressed in human skin. But when he closed his eyes, all he could see was Clara falling in the snow, her small body disappearing under the white, her lips turning blue as the life drained out of her. He had saved her today. But what about tomorrow? What about the next storm, or the one after that? What about when the food ran out, or the roof collapsed, or one of the 100 other disasters that could befall a woman alone on the frontier? Silas looked down at his hands. The hands that had killed Edward Blackwood, Jr. in self-defense. The hands that had broken more bones than he could count. The hands that had refused to light the match when his bosses ordered him to burn down a homestead with children inside. Those hands could fix things, too. Could build fences and patch roofs and chop wood. Could protect instead of destroy. Maybe that was the answer. Maybe he could not change what he had done, but he could change what he did next. Silas did not believe in God, did not believe in fate. But as he looked at that warm light in the cabin window, he wondered if something bigger was at work. If the storm had not just pushed him toward shelter, but toward something he had been searching for his whole life without knowing it. A chance to be better. A reason to stay. Clara knew she was playing with fire. But when that giant of a man picked up a hammer and started fixing her roof like it was the most natural thing in the world, she realized sometimes fire is the only thing that keeps you from freezing to death. It had been 3 days since the storm. 3 days since Silas Maddox had knocked on her door and turned her world sideways. She had expected him to leave that first morning, to saddle his horse and ride off into the snow without a backward glance. Instead, he had looked at her leaking roof, her broken fence, her dwindling woodpile, and said 4 words that changed everything. "Let me help you." She had refused, of course. Pride was one of the few things she had left, and she was not about to surrender it to a stranger, no matter how capable he seemed. But Silas had not accepted her refusal. He had simply walked out to the barn, retrieved his tools from his saddlebags, and started working on the fence. When she had stormed outside to confront him, he had looked at her with those storm-gray eyes and said, "You can yell at me all you want, Mrs. Whitmore, but I am still going to fix this fence." That had been 3 days ago. In that time, he had repaired the fence, patched the worst of the leaks in the roof, chopped enough wood to last the rest of the winter, and somehow convinced Jake that he was the most fascinating person on earth. Clara did not know what to do with any of it. She stood at the window now, watching Silas work on the barn door. It had been hanging crooked for months, scraping against the frame every time she opened it. Thomas had always said he would fix it. He never had. But Silas had taken one look at it this morning and said, "I can have that working smooth by noon." It was not even mid-morning yet, and the door already swung free and easy. "He is good with his hands." Clara jumped at the sound of Maggie O'Brien's voice behind her. She had forgotten the saloon owner was even here. Maggie had ridden out from Silver Creek with supplies Clara could not afford to refuse, even though she suspected they came with strings attached. "He is a stranger," Clara said, without turning from the window. Maggie laughed, a husky sound roughened by years of cigarette smoke and whiskey. "Honey, I have seen the way you look at that stranger, and I have seen the way he looks at you. I do not know what you are talking about." "Sure you do not." Clara finally turned to face her. Maggie O'Brien was 45 years old with fire-red hair fading to gray at the temples and a face that had seen too much to be shocked by anything. She had been a saloon girl before she was a saloon owner, and before that something she never talked about. She was the closest thing Clara had to a friend in Silver Creek. "What do you know about him?" Clara asked. Maggie shrugged. "Not much. He rode into town a week before the storm, kept to himself, paid for his room in cash, did not cause any trouble. But a man that size does not go unnoticed. People talk. What do they say? That he has the look of someone running from something." Maggie's eyes were sharp despite her casual tone, and that he handles himself like a man who knows violence, not just knows it, but is comfortable with it. Clara's stomach tightened. Should I be worried? Maybe. Maggie walked over to stand beside her at the window. They watched Silas lift a beam that would have taken two normal men to move, setting it into place with effortless precision. Then again, a man who wanted to hurt you would not spend 3 days fixing your fence and teaching your boy how to whittle. He taught Jake to whittle, among other things. Maggie smiled. "I saw them out by the corral yesterday. That big man was showing the boy how to approach a horse so it would not spook. Gentle as you please." Clara did not know what to say to that. She had noticed the same thing, the way Silas softened around Jake, the way his voice dropped and his movement slowed, as if he was afraid of scaring the boy. It was the opposite of what she would have expected from a man his size. "He is not what I thought," she admitted. "They never are." Maggie turned from the window. "The question is what you are going to do about it." "I do not know what you mean." "Yes, you do." Maggie fixed her with a look that seemed to see right through her. "You are a young woman, Clara. You have got years ahead of you. You do not have to spend them alone. I am not alone. I have Jake. You know what I mean." Clara looked away. "Thomas has only been gone 3 months. Thomas was gone long before he died." Maggie's voice was gentle but firm. "You told me yourself. The man never touched you with anything resembling warmth. Never made you feel like a wife instead of a servant. That is not a marriage, Clara. That is a sentence." The words stung because they were true. Clara had spent 3 years in a marriage that felt more like a business arrangement than anything resembling love. Thomas had offered her respectability when her family cast her out. He had given her his name and a roof over her head. But he had never given her warmth, never made her feel like anything more than a housekeeper with certain wifely obligations. "I do not know if I am capable of that," she said quietly. "Of letting someone in." Maggie put a hand on her shoulder. "Honey, nobody knows that until they try. But I will tell you this. A man who looks at a broken fence and sees something to fix instead of something to criticize. A man who teaches a lonely boy how to whittle. A man who saves your life and then does not hold it over you. That is not the kind of man who comes along every day." Before Clara could respond, the door opened and Jake burst in, his face flushed with cold and excitement. "Ma! Mr. Silas says he can teach me to ride a real horse, not just the pony, but his big horse. Can I? Please?" Clara looked at her boy, so full of life and hope despite everything he had been through. Then she looked out the window at Silas, who had stopped working and was watching the cabin with something like longing in his eyes. "We will see," she said. "Go wash up for lunch." Jake whooped and ran for the wash basin, nearly knocking over a chair in his excitement. Clara watched him go, her heart aching with love for this child who was not hers by blood but was hers in every way that mattered. "Invite him for supper." Maggie's voice was soft. "See what happens." Maggie left an hour later, her wagon loaded with the supplies Clara could not afford to buy but was too desperate to refuse. Clara watched her go, then took a deep breath and walked out to the barn. Silas was oiling the hinges on the newly fixed door. He looked up when she approached, and something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, more like the ghost of one. "Door works smooth now." He wiped his hands on a rag. "Should not stick anymore." "I see that." Clara wrapped her shawl tighter against the cold. "How much do I owe you?" Silas frowned. "Owe me? For the work? The fence, the roof, the door? You have been at it for 3 days. That is worth something." His frown deepened. I did not ask for payment. I know you did not. But that does not mean you should not receive it. He was quiet for a moment, studying her with those storm-gray eyes. Then he said, "You gave me shelter when you did not have to. You could have turned me away that night, and you did not. The way I see it, I still owe you." Clara did not know what to say to that. Thomas would have demanded payment for any favor, no matter how small. Her aunt and uncle had sold her to settle their debts. The idea that someone would work for 3 days without expecting anything in return was foreign to her. "At least stay for supper," she heard herself say. "Jake has been talking about nothing else all day." Silas's expression softened. "You sure?" "I do not want to impose. It is not imposing if you are invited." He held her gaze for a long moment. Something passed between them, an understanding that went deeper than words. Then he nodded. "I would like that." Supper that night was simple: salt pork, beans, biscuits that Clara had made from the last of her flour. It was not much, but Silas ate like it was a feast, complimenting every dish until Clara felt heat rise to her cheeks. Jake dominated the conversation, peppering Silas with questions about horses and cattle and life on the trail. Silas answered each one patiently, his deep voice rumbling through the small cabin like distant thunder. Clara mostly listened, content to watch the two of them interact. She noticed things she had not seen before. The way Silas cut his meat into small pieces, like someone who had learned to eat quickly and quietly. The way he kept his back to the wall and his eyes on the door, even in the safety of her kitchen. The way he flinched, almost imperceptibly, when Jake's fork scraped against his plate. This was a man who had seen violence. More than that, a man who expected it around every corner. She should have been afraid. Instead, she found herself wanting to know more. After supper, Jake went to bed with minimal protest, exhausted from a day of following Silas around the homestead. Clara and Silas sat by the fire, the silence between them comfortable, rather than awkward. "I should tell you something." His voice was low, rough. "Before this goes any further." Clara's heart stuttered. "Before what goes any further?" Silas stared into the flames. "Whatever this is, whatever it is becoming, whatever it is." He looked at her, and she saw something vulnerable beneath his stoic exterior. "I am not a good man, Clara. I have done things I am not proud of. Things that would make you send me away if you knew. Then why tell me? Because you deserve to know who you have let into your home." He paused. "And because I am tired of running from it." Clara was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the window panes. Another storm coming. Another night of cold and darkness. "We all have pasts," she said finally. "We all have things we are not proud of, not like mine." She looked at him then, really looked. At the scar on his jaw, the silver threading through his dark hair. At the hands that could crush bone but had been so gentle when they pulled her from the snow. "Stay," she said. "Whatever you have done, whatever you are running from, stay until the weather clears. And if you still want to tell me then, I will listen." His eyes searched her face, looking for something. Whatever he found must have satisfied him, because some of the tension left his massive shoulders. "All right." His voice was barely above a whisper. "I will stay." Later that night, after Silas had returned to the barn and the cabin was quiet, Clara lay in bed staring at the ceiling. She thought about Thomas, cold and distant, even in death. She thought about her aunt and uncle, who had sold her like a piece of furniture to pay their debts. And she thought about Silas Maddox, who fixed her fence without asking for payment and looked at her like she was something worth seeing. She did not know what tomorrow would bring. She did not know if she could trust him, or if she was capable of letting anyone pass the walls she had built around her heart. But for the first time in 3 months, maybe the first time in years, she felt something that might have been hope. The next morning, Clara woke to the sound of hammering. She dressed quickly and stepped out onto the porch to find Silas already at work. this time on the chicken coop. Jake was beside him, holding nails with the solemnity of a surgical assistant. When Silas looked up and saw her, something shifted in his storm-gray eyes, something that looked almost like a smile. "Morning, Mrs. Whitmore." "Clara." He blinked. "Ma'am, if you're going to be fixing my chicken coop at sunrise, you might as well call me Clara." The ghost of a smile became real, transforming his rough features into something almost handsome. "All right, then." He tipped his hat to her. "Morning, Clara." She told herself the warmth spreading through her chest was just from the coffee she had not yet had. She knew better. Silas recognized the fancy carriage from a mile off, and his first instinct was to run. But then he looked at Clara standing on the porch, small and defiant, and he knew this time he was not running. The carriage was black lacquer and polished brass, drawn by two matched bay horses that probably cost more than Clara's entire homestead. Two men rode alongside it, and Silas did not need to see their guns to know they were trouble. He recognized the type. Hard men paid to do hard work. He had been one of them once. He set down his hammer and walked toward the cabin, keeping his pace steady. The men on horseback tracked his movement, hands drifting toward their holsters. Clara came down from the porch to meet the carriage as it rolled to a stop in front of her gate. Jake had been helping Silas with the fence, but at some signal Silas had not seen, the boy had disappeared into the barn. Smart kid. The carriage door opened and a man stepped out. He was tall and lean, maybe 55, with silver hair swept back from a face that had probably been handsome before cruelty hardened it into something cold. He wore a suit that would have looked more at home in a Denver ballroom than a Colorado ranch, white as fresh snow and probably worth more than Silas would see in a year. "Mrs. Whitmore." The man's voice was smooth as oil. "I have come to offer my condolences on the loss of your husband." Clara did not move from the porch. "That is very kind of you, Mr. Crane, but Thomas has been dead 3 months. Your condolences are somewhat late." Silas felt his lips twitch despite himself. She had spine, this woman. Harlan Crane smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. "I have been traveling. Business matters. You understand." "I understand you want something." Clara's voice was flat. "What is it?" Crane's smile thinned. "Very well. I will not insult your intelligence with pleasantries. Your husband owed me money, $500 to be precise, plus interest. Thomas did not owe you anything. I have a letter that says otherwise." Crane pulled an envelope from his coat pocket. "Dated 3 days before his death. He promised to repay the money by spring. Spring has come and gone, Mrs. Whitmore." Clara's face did not change, but Silas saw her hands tighten on the porch railing. "That is between you and Thomas. He is dead. The debt died with him. That is not how debts work." Crane tucked the envelope away. "Of course, there are other arrangements we could make. Your homestead, for instance. 200 acres of prime grazing land with the only reliable water source in the valley. I would be willing to forgive the debt entirely in exchange for the deed. This land is not for sale. Everything is for sale, Mrs. Whitmore. It is simply a matter of price." Silas chose that moment to step forward. Clara's eyes flicked to him, and he saw surprise there and something else. Relief, maybe. Crane's men noticed him too. Their hands went to their guns, but Silas kept his hands visible and his movements slow. "The lady said the land is not for sale." Crane turned, and Silas saw recognition flash in those cold eyes. Not recognition of him specifically, but of what he was. A dangerous man, a man who knew violence. And who might you be? Just a hand hired to fix some fences. Silas kept his voice flat. "But even a hired hand knows when to step in. This is a private matter between Mrs. Whitmore and myself. Nothing private about threatening a widow in front of her own house." Silas let his eyes drift to the two men on horseback, then back to Crane. "You might want to take your business elsewhere." The tension stretched like a wire about to snap. Crane's men were watching him, calculating. They saw what Crane had seen, that this was not a man to be taken lightly. But there were two of them, and one of him, and they had guns while he appeared unarmed. They did not know about the knife in his boot, or the years of training that made it as deadly as any pistol. Crane broke the silence first. Very well. He turned back to Clara with a smile that did not touch his eyes. I can see this is not a good time. But think about my offer, Mrs. Whitmore. Think about it carefully. I am a patient man, but my patience has limits. He climbed back into the carriage, and without another word, his men turned their horses and followed him back down the road. Silas watched them go, every muscle in his body coiled tight. Come inside. Clara's voice was quiet. We need to talk. The cabin felt smaller with Silas inside it, his massive frame filling the space. Clara poured 2 cups of coffee with hands that were not quite steady and sat across from him at the kitchen table. $500. She did not look at him. That is what he says Thomas owed him. Is it true? Clara was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, I found money in the cellar after Thomas died. $500 in a flour sack. I did not know where it came from. Silas waited. Now I do. Her voice was bitter. Thomas cheated him somehow, took his money and hid it. And now Crane wants it back, so give it to him. Clara looked up, her blue eyes flashing. And admit that Thomas was a thief? Let that man have the satisfaction of being right. Is your pride worth your land? It is not about pride. Her hands tightened around her coffee cup. If I pay him, he will just find another excuse to come back. He does not want the money, Silas. He wants this land, the water rights, and he will not stop until he gets them. Silas knew she was right. He had seen men like Harlan Crane before. Rich men who thought they could take whatever they wanted, who used money and power like weapons. They did not negotiate. They did not compromise. They just kept pushing until they got what they wanted, one way or another. What are you going to do? He asked. Clara met his eyes. I am going to fight. Silas felt something shift in his chest. Not quite admiration, deeper than that. You know he will not fight fair. I know. You could get hurt, or worse. I know that too. She set down her coffee cup. But this is my land, Silas. Mine and Jake's. I will not let some bully in a fancy suit take it from us. Silas looked at her for a long moment, small and fierce and stubborn as a mule. She reminded him of someone he had known a long time ago, someone he had failed to protect. Then I will help you. Clara blinked. What? You heard me. He leaned forward, his massive hands flat on the table. I will help you fight him, whatever it takes. Why? Because you gave me shelter when you did not have to. Because you took in an orphan boy who was not yours. Because you are the first person in 10 years who has looked at me like I might be worth something. The words hung in the air between them. Clara's eyes were bright, and he saw her throat work as she swallowed. You do not even know what you are getting into, she said. I know enough. Crane has money, power, men with guns. I have dealt with men like him before. She studied him, really looking at him for the first time. And he found himself wanting to tell her everything. About the mining company and the things they had made him do. About the night he refused to burn down a homestead with children inside. About the man he had killed in self-defense and the bounty that had been on his head ever since. But not yet. Not until he knew she could handle it. Whatever happens, he said quietly, you will not face it alone. Clara was quiet for a long time. Outside, he could hear Jake playing with the chickens, his laughter bright against the afternoon silence. Then she reached across the table and put her hand over his. Her fingers were small against his scarred knuckles, delicate and work-roughened at the same time. Thank you. Silas turned his hand over, letting her fingers rest against his palm. It was such a small thing, that touch, but it felt like the most important thing that had happened to him in years. Do not thank me yet, he said. We have not won anything. Clara smiled, and it transformed her face, made her look younger, softer, beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with features and everything to do with spirit. No, but for the first time, I think we might. That afternoon, Silas rode into Silver Creek to gather information. The town was small, just a main street with a general store, a church, a sheriff's office, and a saloon. He headed for the saloon. Maggie O'Brien's place was exactly what he expected. Dark wood, sticky floors, the smell of whiskey and tobacco smoke. A handful of men sat at tables playing cards, and a woman with red hair going gray stood behind the bar. She looked up when he walked in, and her eyes went sharp. "You are the one staying at Clara Whitmore's place." Silas stopped at the bar. News travels fast. In a town this size, news is about the only thing that does. She set down the glass she was polishing. "What can I get you?" "Whiskey and information." Maggie poured his drink and slid it across the bar. "Information about what?" "Harlan Crane." Her face went carefully blank. "That is a dangerous subject. I am a dangerous man." She studied him for a long moment. Then she leaned forward, lowering her voice. "Crane owns half this territory. Made his money in cattle, then expanded into land. He has been buying up every homestead he can get his hands on, legal or not. And the ones that will not sell," Maggie shrugged, "they tend to have accidents. Fires, fences cut, cattle poisoned. Nothing anyone can prove, but everyone knows." Silas's jaw tightened. "What about the sheriff?" "Dan Burke is a good man, but his hands are tied. Crane owns the territorial judge. Any case that goes to court gets dismissed, so Crane does whatever he wants. Pretty much." Maggie's eyes were hard. "He has been after the Whitmore place for years. Only reason he did not take it while Thomas was alive was because Thomas had something on him. Some kind of leverage. What kind of leverage? No idea. But whatever it was, it died with Thomas." She paused. "There is something else you should know." "What?" "Crane has a son. Victor, 28 years old, mean as a snake, and obsessed with Clara Whitmore." Silas felt something cold settle in his gut. Obsessed how? The way a boy pulls wings off flies. He wants her because he cannot have her. And he is not the type to take no for an answer. Did he ever try anything? Once. When Thomas was still alive. Thomas put a stop to it somehow. Rumor is that is when Thomas started holding whatever leverage he had over Harlan. Silas finished his whiskey in one long swallow. "Where can I find the sheriff?" "Office is at the end of the street." Maggie watched him head for the door. "Mister? Be careful. Crane has eyes everywhere. If he finds out you are asking questions, he will come for you next." "Let him come." Silas found Sheriff Daniel Burke sitting on the porch of his office, whittling a piece of wood. He was a big man, maybe 50, with a weathered face and eyes that had seen too much. "Silas Maddox." Burke did not look up from his whittling. "I was wondering when you would come see me. You know my name. I know everyone's name in this territory." Burke set down his knife. "I also know you have been staying at the Whitmore place, helping out with the repairs. Is that a problem?" "Depends." Burke finally looked at him, and his eyes were sharp. "I know your face, Maddox. Cannot place it yet, but I will." Silas kept his expression neutral. "When you do, I hope you will also remember I have not caused any trouble here, not yet." Burke stood, and he was almost as tall as Silas, though not as broad. "Mrs. Whitmore is good people. She has had enough heartache without some drifter adding to it. I am not here to cause heartache. What are you here for?" Silas considered the question. "Maybe looking for something I lost a long time ago." Burke studied him for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "Crane came to see her today." "I know, I was there. He will be back. And next time he might not be so polite." "I figured." Burke picked up his knife and went back to whittling. "If you are planning to stick around, you might want to watch your back. Crane has a way of making problems disappear. I have a way of making problems regret they ever started." Burke almost smiled. I believe you might. He paused. Just make sure Mrs. Whitmore does not get caught in the crossfire. She will not. Silas walked back to his horse, his mind churning. Crane was more dangerous than he had thought, more connected, more powerful. But Silas had faced dangerous men before. He had been one himself, and he had learned something important in all those years of violence. It was not the biggest or the richest who won. It was the one who wanted it most. Harlan Crane wanted land, money, power. Money. Silas wanted something far more valuable. He wanted redemption, and he was willing to fight for it. Clara found the money at midnight. $500 in cash stuffed into the pocket of Thomas's old coat. But with it was a letter, and what was written there made her wish she had never opened it. She sat at the kitchen table, the lamp burning low, the letter spread before her. Jake was asleep in his room. Silas was in the barn where he had been sleeping for the past week. The cabin was quiet except for the wind outside and the pounding of her own heart. The letter was in Thomas's handwriting, cramped and precise. It was addressed to Harlan Crane. Dear Harlan, by the time you read this, our arrangement will be complete. The shipment has been delivered to the location we discussed. The contacts you provided have been most helpful in distributing the merchandise to our clients in the territory. I trust you will find the profits to your satisfaction. My share, as agreed, is enclosed. Yours in business, Thomas Whitmore. Clara read it 3 times before the meaning sank in. Merchandise, clients, profits. Thomas had been smuggling something. Guns, probably, given what Maggie had hinted about Crane's business dealings. He had been partners with Harlan Crane in something illegal, something dangerous. And then he had cheated him. Clara looked at the $500 spread across the table. This was not savings. This was Thomas's cut of whatever criminal enterprise he and Crane had cooked up together. She was living on dirty money. The realization hit her like a physical blow. For 3 years, she had thought Thomas was just cold, distant, a man who saw her as property rather than a partner. But this was worse. This was criminal. And now Crane wanted his money back. Not because Thomas owed him a legitimate debt, but because Thomas had double-crossed him in their illegal dealings. Clara wanted to throw the money in the fire, wanted to burn it and the letter and every memory of the man she had been forced to marry. But she could not, because this letter was leverage. If Crane was involved in gun running, if he was selling weapons to who knew what dangerous elements, then this letter was proof, evidence that could bring him down, if she was brave enough to use it. Clara gathered up the money and the letter and hid them both under a loose board beneath her bed. Then she lay down and stared at the ceiling, her mind racing. She could not tell Silas, not yet, not until she figured out what to do. But even as she thought it, she knew she was lying to herself. She could not tell Silas because she was afraid of what he would think when he learned the truth about Thomas, afraid he would look at her differently, see her as the wife of a criminal rather than the woman she was trying to become. And she could not bear that. Not now. Not when she was just starting to feel something she had thought herself incapable of feeling. Something that felt dangerously like love. The next evening, a light storm rolled across the plains, coating the world in a fresh layer of white. Jake had gone to bed early, worn out from a day of helping Silas with the horses. Clara sat by the fire, pretending to mend a shirt while her thoughts churned. Silas came in from the barn, stomping snow off his boots. He had started joining her for the evening hours, sitting by the fire while she worked. They did not always talk. Sometimes they just sat in comfortable silence, sharing space in a way Clara had never experienced with Thomas. Tonight, she could not stay silent. Have you ever loved anyone? The question slipped out before she could stop it. Silas went still, his big hands frozen in the act of warming them by the fire. Once, he said after a long moment. A long time ago. What happened? She died. His voice was flat. Because I could not protect her. Clara set down her mending. What do you mean? Silas was quiet for so long she thought he would not answer. Then he said, I was working for some bad people, did some bad things. There was a woman. She was innocent. Got caught in the crossfire because of me. That was not your fault. Yes, it was. He finally looked at her, and his storm-gray eyes were haunted. I put her in danger by being near her, by thinking I could have a normal life while doing what I was doing. She paid the price for my selfishness. Clara moved closer without thinking about it. Her body seemed to act on its own, drawn to him like a moth to flame. You are not that person anymore. How do you know? Because I see you. She reached out and touched his face, feeling the roughness of his stubble against her palm. I see the way you treat Jake, the way you treat me. A bad man does not spend 3 weeks fixing a stranger's fence. A bad man does not save a woman from freezing and then apologize for touching her. Silas caught her wrist, but he did not pull away. Clara, why do you always keep your distance? His jaw tightened. Because I do not trust myself. Why? Because these hands have done things. His voice was rough. Terrible things. I'm afraid I would hurt you without meaning to. Clara's heart was pounding. You have never had a man my size, he continued, and the words sent heat flooding through her. I do not want the first thing you know about closeness to be fear. Then show me the difference. She heard the words come out of her mouth and could not believe she was saying them. Show me how it is supposed to be. Silas stared at her. His storm-gray eyes were dark with something she had never seen before, something hungry. You do not know what you are asking. I know exactly what I am asking. He was silent for a long moment. Then he said, You do not know who I am, what I have done. I know what you are doing, right now. That is enough. Something broke in him then. She saw it happen, saw the wall he had built around himself crack and crumble. He kissed her. It was nothing like what she had experienced with Thomas. Thomas had kissed her like it was a chore to be completed. Silas kissed her like she was the most precious thing in the world, like he was afraid she might shatter, like he had been waiting his whole life for this moment. His hands came up to cup her face, huge and gentle. She felt the strength in them, the controlled power. He could crush her without effort. Instead, he held her like she was made of glass, Clara. Her name was a prayer on his lips when they finally broke apart. I should not have done that. Do not you dare apologize. His laugh was low and rough. I am not apologizing, I am warning you. Warning me about what? He rested his forehead against hers. If we do this, there is no going back. I am not a man who does things halfway. If you let me in, I will never leave. Not unless you tell me to. Clara thought about Thomas, about 3 years of coldness and loneliness, about never being touched like she mattered, never being looked at like she was worth seeing. Then stay, she whispered. Stay and never leave. Silas kissed her again. This time there was more heat, more urgency. His hand slid down to her waist, spanning nearly the entire width of it. She felt the tremor that ran through his massive frame, the effort it took to hold back. But he did hold back. When things started to go too far, he pulled away, his breath ragged. Not tonight. Clara wanted to protest. Her body was humming with sensations she had never felt before. But she saw the determination in his eyes and understood. Not until you know everything about me. Then tell me. He shook his head. Not tonight. Tonight I just want to hold you. So he did. They sat together by the dying fire. Clara curled against his chest, his arms wrapped around her like a shield. She listened to his heartbeat, slow and steady, and felt something shift inside her. For the first time in her life, she felt safe. When morning came, the world had changed. Clara woke in her own bed, having slipped away sometime in the night while Silas dozed by the fire. She stretched, feeling muscles she had not known existed. Nothing had happened between them, not really. Just kisses and touches and whispered words. But it felt like everything had changed. She dressed quickly and stepped out onto the porch, expecting to see Silas already at work on whatever project he had chosen for the day. Instead, she saw a stranger at the gate. He was lean and hard-looking, with the sun-weathered face of a man who spent his life outdoors. He sat his horse with the easy confidence of someone who knew how to use the gun on his hip, and in his hand was a wanted poster. "Morning, ma'am." His voice was polite but firm. "I am looking for a man named Silas Maddox. Word is he has been staying here." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. She looked at the poster, saw Silas's face staring back at her, saw the words underneath. Wanted for murder. Silas Maddox. $200 reward. The stranger watched her reaction with knowing eyes. "I take it that is a yes." Silas always knew this day would come. He had just hoped it would come after he had a chance to say goodbye. Now it was too late, and the look in Clara's eyes when she saw that poster cut through him like a knife. He had heard the hoofbeats from the barn and emerged just in time to see Clara's face go pale. Now he stood at the edge of the porch, 20 feet from a bounty hunter with his hand on his gun, and the woman he loved between them. "Jeb Rawlins." Silas kept his voice flat. "Should have known you would find me eventually." The bounty hunter tipped his hat. "Silas Maddox, you are a hard man to track. Took me the better part of 6 months. You should have given up." Jeb smiled without humor. $200 says otherwise." Clara had not moved. She stood on the porch, the wanted poster clenched in her hands, staring at Silas with an expression he could not read. "Is it true?" Her voice was steady, but he could see the tremor in her hands. Silas looked at her, at the woman who had given him shelter when she had nothing to give, who had let him into her home, her life, her heart. He could lie, could claim the poster was wrong, that it was a case of mistaken identity. Jeb would not contradict him until they were alone. He could buy himself a few more hours of her trust. But he was done lying. "Yes." The word hung in the air. Clara's face went even paler, but she did not look away. "You killed someone." "Yes." "Who?" "His name was Edward Blackwood, Jr. He was the son of the man who owned the mining company I worked for." Clara's jaw tightened. "Why?" Silas took a breath. "Because he tried to shoot me in the back, after I refused to burn down a homestead with children inside." Silence. Even Jeb looked uncomfortable, shifting in his saddle. Clara turned to the bounty hunter. "Is that true?" Jeb shrugged. "I just collect the bounties, ma'am. I do not ask questions." "Well, I am asking." Clara's voice had gone hard. "Is what he said true? Was it self-defense? The Blackwood family says it was murder. And what do the witnesses say?" Jeb was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "There are not any." Blackwood had cleared the camp before the confrontation. It is his word against Maddox's, and Maddox is not alive to give his word. Clara's eyes flashed. "So a dead man's family gets to decide what happened?" "Ma'am, I do not make the rules. I just follow the money." Clara stepped off the porch. She walked right past Jeb's horse, ignoring the bounty hunter entirely, until she was standing in front of Silas. "Tell me everything." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "No more secrets, no more half-truths. Tell me who you are." Silas looked into her sky-blue eyes and saw something he had not expected. Not fear, not judgment, a chance. "I was an enforcer," he said, "for the Blackwood Mining Company out of Montana. They hired me to persuade people to sell their land. When persuasion did not work, I used other methods." Clara did not flinch. "What kind of methods? The kind that leave scars, the kind that make men wake up screaming, the kind I am not proud of. Did you kill people?" "One. In a bar fight before I even joined the company. Man pulled a knife on me. I hit him too hard." He was quiet for a moment. "That is how Blackwood found me. He said I had a talent for violence, said he could use a man like me, so you went to work for him." "I did. For 5 years I did whatever they told me. Burned crops, poisoned wells, beat men in front of their families." He forced himself to meet her eyes. "I told myself it was just business, that I was not the one making the decisions, but I was the one swinging the fists. I was the one lighting the matches." "What changed?" "They ordered me to burn down a homestead. Family inside. Father, mother, 3 children." Silas's voice cracked. "The father would not sell. Blackwood said to make an example. And you refused. I refused. Clara was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "And Edward?" "He came after me when I rode away. Shot at me from behind. I turned and shot back. Did not mean to kill him. Just wanted to stop him from killing me." "But you did kill him." "Yes." She studied his face, searching for something. Silas did not know what she found, but after what felt like an eternity, she nodded. "That is the difference." "What?" "Between you and them." Clara's voice was steady. "They would have burned those children alive and slept soundly that night. You could not. That is why you ran. That is why you are still running." Silas felt something break open in his chest, something he had kept locked away for years. "Does that make it better? All the things I did before?" "No." Her honesty was brutal and kind at the same time. "Nothing makes those things better. But it means you are not beyond redemption. It means the man you are becoming is worth fighting for." Jeb cleared his throat. "This is all very touching, but I've got a job to do." Clara turned to face him. "And if I gave you information worth more than $200? The bounty hunter raised an eyebrow. "I am listening." Clara pulled the letter from her pocket. The one she had found with Thomas's money, the one she had been hiding for days. Harlan Crane. She held up the letter. "The wealthiest man in the territory. I have evidence that he has been running guns, illegal weapons to dangerous elements in the territory. Evidence that would be worth a lot more than any bounty on Silas Maddox." Jeb's eyes went sharp. "How much more?" "Enough to bring down one of the richest men in Colorado. Enough to make you famous instead of just paid." The bounty hunter was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You have proof?" "I have a letter in Thomas Whitmore's own hand detailing the operation. Names, dates, locations." Jeb looked at Silas, then back at Clara. "You want me to let him go?" "I want you to give us 48 hours. Clara's voice was steady. "If I can get you what you need to bring down Crane, you walk away from Maddox. If I cannot, you can take him in. And if you are lying, then you lose nothing but 2 days of your life." Jeb considered. Then he swung down from his horse. 48 hours. He held out his hand. "And if you try to run, Maddox, I will hunt you to the ends of the earth." Silas shook his hand. "I am done running." That night, Clara finally let herself fall. She had sent Jake to stay with Maggie in town, claiming she needed him to help with inventory at the saloon. The boy had been suspicious, but Maggie had played along, promising him all the penny candy he could eat. Now it was just the two of them, Clara and Silas, alone in the cabin with the fire burning low and the truth laid bare between them. "You should not have done that." Silas stood by the window, his massive frame silhouetted against the darkness. "Shown him the letter. Put yourself at risk for me." Clara walked up behind him, put her hand on his back, felt him tense beneath her touch. "You have protected me since you got here. Now it is my turn." He turned to face her. His storm-gray eyes were dark with something she recognized now. Need, want, love. "I am not worth it." "Yes, you are." "Clara." She reached up and touched his face, felt the roughness of his stubble, the scar that ran from his jaw to his ear. "I do not know what tomorrow will bring," she said softly. "I do not know if our plan will work, or if Crane will destroy us, or if Jeb will drag you off in chains. But I know one thing." "What?" "Tonight, I want to belong to you." Something shifted in his eyes. The control he had been holding on to, the restraint, it cracked. "You do not know what you are asking. I know exactly what I am asking." She pulled him down to her. "Show me, Silas. Show me what I have been missing." He kissed her. Not gentle this time. Not careful. His hands gripped her waist, lifted her like she weighed nothing. "You have never had a man my size. His voice was rough against her ear, sending shivers down her spine. "Let me show you how it is done." And he did. He carried her to the bedroom, laid her down like she was something precious. Then he showed her with hands and lips and body exactly what the difference was between duty and desire. Thomas had touched her like she was a task to be completed. Silas touched her like she was a miracle. He was gentle when she needed gentle, fierce when she needed fierce. He paid attention to every sound she made, every catch of her breath, every arch of her back. He made her feel things she had not known she could feel. And when it was over, when they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, Clara understood something for the first time. This was what it meant to be loved. Not possessed, not used. Loved. "You are crying." Silas's voice was worried. "Did I hurt you?" "No." Clara wiped her eyes, laughing at herself. "You did the opposite." "Then why the tears?" "Because I did not know it could be like this." She looked up at him, at this mountain of a man who held her like she might break. "I did not know I could feel like this." Silas pulled her closer, tucking her head beneath his chin. "Neither did I." They lay like that as the fire died to embers. Clara listened to his heartbeat, slow and steady. She thought about tomorrow, about Crane, about the danger they both faced. But for now, in this moment, she was exactly where she wanted to be. In the arms of the man she loved. She made her decision in the early hours of the morning. Silas was asleep, his breathing deep and even. Clara slipped out of bed, dressed quietly, and wrote him a note. "Do not worry. I will be back soon." Then she took the letter, tucked her derringer into her corset, and slipped out into the pre-dawn darkness. She was going to face Harlan Crane, alone. Clara wore the finest dress she owned, the one she had not touched since Thomas's funeral. She walked into the lion's den with a smile on her face and a gun tucked inside her corset. The Crane mansion sat on a hill overlooking Silver Creek, a monument to wealth and power that dwarfed everything around it. 3 stories of gleaming white stone surrounded by manicured gardens and a fence that probably cost more than Clara's entire homestead. She rode through the gates without hesitation. If she stopped to think about what she was doing, she would lose her nerve. A servant met her at the door, a thin man in a black suit who looked at her like she was something he had found on the bottom of his shoe. "I am here to see Mr. Crane. Mr. Crane does not receive visitors without an appointment. Tell him Mrs. Whitmore is here to discuss a business proposition." Clara kept her voice steady. "Tell him it is about the money." The servant's expression flickered. He disappeared inside, leaving Clara standing on the marble steps like a common beggar. She did not wait long. The servant returned and led her through a foyer larger than her entire cabin, down a hallway lined with paintings that probably cost more than she would see in a lifetime. He stopped at a door of polished oak and knocked once. "Enter." The study was everything Clara had expected. Dark wood paneling, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a massive desk that gleamed with polish. Behind it sat Harlan Crane, his white suit immaculate, his silver hair swept back. "Mrs. Whitmore," he did not rise. "I did not expect you to come alone. I came to negotiate." Crane's lips curved in what might have been a smile. "Did you now?" Clara moved to the chair in front of his desk and sat without being invited. "You want the $500 Thomas owed you. I am willing to pay it." Crane raised an eyebrow. "That is a change of tune. I am a practical woman, Mr. Crane. I know when I am outmatched." He leaned back in his chair, studying her with those cold eyes. "And what do you want in return?" "A signed document stating that Thomas's debt is settled in full, and a promise that you will leave my homestead alone." "That is all?" "That is all." Crane was quiet for a moment. Then he laughed, a sound like ice cracking. "I must say, Mrs. Whitmore, you are either very brave or very stupid. I prefer to think of myself as practical." Practicality. He stood and walked to the window, looking out over his empire. "Your husband was practical, too. He saw an opportunity and he took it. Shame he had to go and get greedy." Clara's hands tightened on her handbag, where the letter was hidden. And what opportunity was that? Crane turned to face her. His expression had gone cold. You know exactly what opportunity. You found the letter, did you not? Clara felt her blood turn to ice, but she kept her face calm. I found a letter. I was not sure what it meant. Of course you were not. Crane walked toward her, slow and deliberate. Your husband was running guns for me, Mrs. Whitmore. Selling weapons to whoever would pay. Comancheros, outlaw gangs, anyone with enough gold. Clara's stomach lurched, but she forced herself to stay still. That must have been very profitable. It was. Until Thomas decided he wanted a bigger cut. Crane stopped in front of her chair, looming over her. He stole from me, Mrs. Whitmore. Skimmed money off the top for 3 years. And when I found out, he threatened to expose the whole operation if I did not let him walk away. So you killed him. Crane smiled. Thomas died of a heart attack. Everyone knows that. Everyone knows what you want them to know. The smile faded. What exactly are you implying? Clara stood, bringing herself face to face with him, or as close to face as she could manage given his height. I am implying that I have your letter, Mr. Crane, the one Thomas wrote detailing your entire operation. Names, dates, locations, everything the U.S. Marshal would need to put you away for the rest of your life. Crane's face went pale. For the first time, Clara saw fear in his eyes. You are bluffing. Am I? Clara pulled the envelope from her handbag. Would you like to see it? Before Crane could respond, the door burst open. Victor Crane strode into the room like he owned it, which Clara supposed in a way he did. Father, I heard we had a visitor. His eyes landed on Clara, and something ugly flickered in them. Mrs. Whitmore. What a pleasant surprise. Clara felt her skin crawl. She had managed to avoid Victor since Thomas's death, but she remembered their last encounter all too well. The way he had cornered her in the general store, his hands grabbing at her, his breath hot on her neck. Thomas had appeared out of nowhere and put a stop to it, but Thomas was gone now. Victor. Harlan's voice was sharp. This is a private meeting. Private meetings with beautiful widows? Victor circled around Clara like a wolf around a lamb. How interesting. Victor, I said, leave, and I said no. Victor stopped in front of Clara, too close. She could smell the whiskey on his breath, see the hunger in his eyes. You and I have unfinished business, Mrs. Whitmore. I have no business with you. Now that is where you are wrong. He reached out and touched her hair. Clara jerked back, but he grabbed her arm. We have been dancing around each other for 3 years. I think it is time we stopped dancing. Let go of me. Or what? He laughed. Your husband is dead. That big stranger you have been keeping around is not here to save you. And Father, well. Victor glanced at Harlan. Father knows better than to interfere. Clara's hand went to her corset. Her fingers found the derringer. Victor, do not be a fool. Harlan's voice was tight. She has the letter. I do not care about your stupid letter. Victor's grip tightened on Clara's arm. I care about what I have been denied for 3 years. Clara pulled out the derringer and pressed it against his chest. Let go. Victor's eyes went wide. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Victor laughed and knocked the gun out of her hand. A derringer. He shoved her against the wall, pinning her with his body. That little thing would barely leave a bruise. Clara did not freeze. She brought her knee up hard into his groin. Victor doubled over with a howl of pain. Clara grabbed for the derringer, but Harlan got there first. That is enough. She looked up to find Harlan Crane pointing her own gun at her. You have caused quite enough trouble, Mrs. Whitmore. Clara straightened, her heart pounding. If you kill me, the letter goes straight to the marshal. I am not going to kill you. Harlan gestured to one of the hired guns who had appeared in the doorway. I am going to keep you here until I figure out what to do with you. Strong hands grabbed her arms. Clara struggled, but it was useless. As they dragged her toward the door, she saw Victor straightening up, murder in his eyes. When this is over, he snarled, You and I are going to finish what we started." Clara met his gaze without flinching. "In your dreams." The last thing she saw before they threw her into the storage room was Harlan's face, pale and calculating, already planning his next move. But Clara was planning too. Because she had done one thing right. She had hidden the real letter in the church before she came here. The one in her handbag had been a blank piece of paper. In the darkness of her prison, Clara waited. She did not know how long she had been there. Hours, probably. The storage room had no windows, no light except the thin strip that crept under the door. She should have been afraid. She was trapped, unarmed, at the mercy of men who wanted to destroy her. But all she felt was certainty. Silas would come. She did not know how, did not know when. But she knew it as surely as she knew her own name. He would come for her. And when he did, Harlan Crane would learn the price of crossing the wrong people. Clara smiled in the darkness. Let them think they had won. The real battle was just beginning. Silas found Clara's note at noon. "Do not worry, I will be back soon." 4 hours later, she still was not home. He read the note again, as if the words might change if he stared at them long enough. But they stayed the same. Calm. Reassuring. A lie. Clara had gone to face Harlan Crane alone. Silas did not remember saddling his horse, did not remember the ride into Silver Creek. One moment he was standing in Clara's cabin, his hands shaking with fear and rage. The next, he was bursting through the doors of Maggie's saloon. The redhead looked up from behind the bar, and her face went pale. "Where is Jake?" "In the back, doing his lessons." Maggie was already moving toward him. "What happened?" Clara went to see Crane. Silas's voice was barely human. "Alone." Maggie stopped cold. "Lord have mercy, I need information. Where is his house? How many men does he have? What is the layout? Silas, wait." Maggie grabbed his arm. "You cannot just ride in there with guns blazing. Crane has 6 hired guns. You would be dead before you reached the front door. Then tell me another way." Before Maggie could respond, the saloon doors swung open again. Sheriff Burke stepped inside, his face grim. "Maddox, I was just coming to find you." Silas turned on him. "If you are here to arrest me, you picked the wrong day. I am not here to arrest you." Burke walked over, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. "I am here because someone saw Clara Whitmore ride into Crane's mansion this morning, and nobody has seen her come out." Something cold settled in Silas's gut. "How long?" 4 hours, maybe 5. Silas looked at Maggie, then back at Burke. "Are you going to help me get her back?" Burke was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I have wanted to take down Harlan Crane for 10 years. Never had the evidence. Never had the opportunity. And now? Now I have a woman held against her will and a wanted man asking for my help." Burke almost smiled. "Seems like opportunity to me." Silas felt something shift in his chest. Not quite hope. More like the beginning of a plan. "We need Jeb Rawlins." "The bounty hunter?" Maggie frowned. "Why?" "Because he worked for the same kind of people Crane works for. He knows how they think, how they operate, and he owes me 48 hours. They found Jeb at the boarding house playing solitaire in his room." He listened to Silas's explanation without interrupting. "So, let me get this straight." Jeb laid down a card. "You want me to help you break into the mansion of the richest man in the territory, assault his guards, rescue a woman who may already be dead, and for this, I get nothing but the satisfaction of a job well done." "No." Silas leaned forward. "For this, you get the evidence to bring down a gun-running operation that has been operating in this territory for years. You get fame, you get glory, and you get to stick it to the kind of men who used to give you orders." Jeb looked at him, then at Burke, then back at the cards. "That mining company killed my brother." "I did not know that. Nobody does." Jeb set down the deck. He was a prospector, found a claim on land they wanted. They sent men to convince him to sell. When he would not, they killed him and made it look like an accident. Silas was quiet. I have been hunting men like them ever since. Jeb stood, not for the money, for the satisfaction. He held out his hand. So yes, Maddox, I will help you, but not for the evidence, for the chance to burn men like Crane to the ground. Silas shook his hand. That is good enough for me. They gathered in the back room of Maggie's saloon to plan. Burke spread a rough map of the Crane property on the table. 6 hired guns that we know of. Maybe more. The mansion has 3 floors, plus a cellar. If they are holding Clara, she is probably in one of the back rooms on the ground floor. Or the cellar. Jeb studied the map. That is where I would put someone I did not want found. What about Victor? Silas's voice was tight. Burke and Maggie exchanged a look. Victor is dangerous, Maggie said quietly. More dangerous than his father in some ways. Harlan is cold and calculating. Victor is just cruel. If he has touched her. Silas did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. Burke cleared his throat. We go in quiet. No guns unless absolutely necessary. Silas, you are the distraction. Draw their attention to the front while Jeb and I slip in through the servants' entrance. And then? Then we find Clara and get her out. And Crane? Silas, Burke's voice was careful. I need him alive, to stand trial, to answer for what he has done. Fine. Silas stood. But Victor is mine. Nobody argued. They were about to leave when the saloon doors burst open and Jake came running in. Silas! Jake's face was streaked with tears. Men came to the cabin. They took me and they said if you wanted to see me alive again, you had to come to the mansion. The room went cold. Silas knelt down, putting his hands on Jake's shoulders. Men took you? They had guns. Jake was shaking. They put me in a wagon. But I jumped out when they were not looking and ran. Did they follow you? I do not know. I ran through the woods. I do not think they saw which way I went. Silas looked up at the others. His face had gone hard as stone. Crane has Clara. Now he is trying to use Jake as leverage. That means they are scared. Jeb's eyes were sharp. They know we are coming. Good. Silas stood. Let them be scared. That changes the plan, Burke said. No. Silas's voice was cold. It makes the plan simpler. Now I have 2 people to save, and nothing to lose. He turned to Maggie. Keep Jake here. Do not let him out of your sight. Maggie nodded, pulling the boy close. Silas looked at Burke and Jeb. Let us end this. They rode out as the sun was setting. Silas led the way, his horse eating up the miles between Silver Creek and the Crane mansion. His mind was clear now, focused. All the fear and rage and uncertainty had burned away, leaving nothing but cold determination. Clara was in there, the woman he loved, the woman who had given him a chance when he did not deserve one. He was going to bring her home, or die trying. They stopped at the edge of the property where the road curved around a stand of pines that blocked the view from the mansion. Burke and Jeb will go around back. Burke drew his pistol, checking the chamber. Give us 15 minutes to get in position. And then raise hell. Silas waited in the darkness. He thought about Clara, the way she had looked when she first pointed that rifle at him, the way she had laughed when he told a joke, the way she had felt in his arms, small and fierce and perfect. He thought about Jake, the boy who was not hers by blood but was hers in every way that mattered, the boy who had looked at him and asked if he was a bad man. He thought about the man he used to be. The monster who had done terrible things for terrible people. And he thought about the man he wanted to become. The man who protected instead of destroyed. The man who built instead of burned. That man was waiting for him on the other side of tonight. All he had to do was survive. Silas checked his guns, touched the knife in his boot, said a prayer to a God he did not quite believe in. Then he rode toward the mansion. Clara heard the first gunshot at midnight, and she knew he had come for her. She had been working on the lock for hours, using a hairpin she had hidden in her hair. It was slow work in the darkness, her fingers cramped and bleeding. But when she heard that shot, she felt a surge of energy. Silas was here. She redoubled her efforts. Silas did not go through the front door. He went through the roof. The mansion was old, built in the style of a Spanish hacienda with a flat roof and a central courtyard. Silas had spotted the access ladder on his scouting run, hidden behind a trellis of climbing roses. He went up fast and quiet, the way he had learned in years of doing things he was not proud of. 2 guards on the roof. He took them down before they knew he was there. Silent, efficient. They would wake up with headaches, but they would wake up. He was not that man anymore, the one who killed without thinking. But he was still the man who knew how to use violence when violence was required. He dropped through a skylight into an empty hallway, drew his guns. The mansion erupted into chaos. Clara got the lock open just as someone started pounding on the door from the outside. "Mrs. Whitmore," a voice she recognized. "Jeb Rawlins, we are getting you out." The door burst open. Jeb stood there with Sheriff Burke, both of them armed and ready. "Are you hurt?" Burke's eyes swept over her. "I am fine." Clara pushed past them into the hallway. "Where is Silas?" "Raising hell, apparently." Jeb gestured toward the sound of gunfire. "Come on, we need to get you out." "Not without Jake. The boy is safe. Maggie has him." Clara felt her knees go weak with relief, but she did not stop moving. Then, not without Silas. "Ma'am, you need to leave." Clara grabbed Burke's arm. "I am not leaving without him. Now where is he?" Burke looked at her for a long moment. Then he pointed down the hall. "Parlor. Last I heard." Clara ran. Silas found Victor in the parlor. The younger Crane was standing in the middle of the room, a gun in one hand and a bottle of whiskey in the other. His eyes were wild, his white shirt stained with blood that was not his own. "Maddox." Victor's voice was slurred. "I was hoping you would come." "Where is Clara?" "Safe. For now." Victor took a swig from the bottle. "But you know, I have been thinking. Father wants to use her as leverage. Make deals. Keep things quiet." He laughed. "But I do not care about deals. I care about taking what I want." Silas's hand tightened on his gun. "You touch her, you die." "I already touched her." Victor's grin was ugly. Years ago. Would have done more if her pathetic husband had not interrupted. Something snapped in Silas. He moved without thinking. The gun came up. His finger found the trigger, and then he stopped. Clara's voice echoed in his head. "You are not that man anymore." He lowered the gun. Victor laughed. "What is the matter? Lost your nerve?" "No." Silas set the gun aside. "I just decided you are not worth a bullet." He crossed the room in 3 strides. Victor tried to raise his gun, but Silas was faster. His fist connected with Victor's jaw, and the younger man went down hard. Victor scrambled to his feet, swinging wildly. Silas blocked, countered, methodical and precise. He had 30 pounds and 6 inches on Victor, plus years of experience the other man could not imagine. It was not a fight. It was a lesson. When it was over, Victor was on the floor, blood streaming from his nose and mouth. Silas stood over him, breathing hard. "I could kill you." Silas's voice was quiet. "Part of me wants to." Victor spat blood. "Then do it. Prove what you really are." Silas looked at him for a long moment. Then he shook his head. "I know what I am. A man who used to be a monster. A man who is trying to be better." He stepped back. "Killing you would be easy. Living with the choice not to, that is hard. But that is the man I want to be." He turned to find Clara standing in the doorway. Her eyes were wide. Her dress was torn. There was a bruise forming on her cheek, but she was alive. She was safe. "Clara!" She ran to him. He caught her, lifted her off her feet, held her so tight he was afraid he might break her. "You came. I will always come." He buried his face in her hair. "Always." Burke and Jeb appeared in the doorway, Harlan Crane in handcuffs between them. The old man looked at his son on the floor, then at Silas and Clara. His face was gray with defeat. "It is over." Burke's voice was firm. "Harlan Crane, you are under arrest for kidnapping, gun running, and conspiracy to commit murder. You will never make it stick. We have a letter." Burke smiled grimly. "Names, dates, locations. Enough to put you away for the rest of your life." Crane's face went even paler. As they led him away, Burke paused beside Silas. "That wanted poster. I did some checking. 3 witnesses came forward in Montana. Said Blackwood shot first. Said you were defending yourself." Silas stared at him. "What are you saying?" "I am saying the bounty has been withdrawn." He smiled. "You are a free man, Maddox." Clara's arms tightened around him. Free. After everything. After all the running, all the hiding, all the shame and guilt and fear. Free. Silas looked down at Clara, at the woman who had given him shelter in a storm, who had seen the monster he had been and loved him anyway. "Let us go home," she whispered. "Yes." He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. "Let us go home." Clara Whitmore had been a widow twice, once by death, once by loneliness. But this morning, as she stepped down from the wagon and looked at the little cabin on the Colorado plains, she knew she would never be a widow again. The sun was rising over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. The snow had finally started to melt, revealing the brown grass beneath. Spring was coming. New life. New beginnings. Jake ran ahead to check on the chickens, his boots squelching in the mud. He had not stopped smiling since they told him what happened. Told him that the bad men were going away and they were safe. Safe. It was a word Clara had not been able to use for a long time. But now it felt real. Solid. Hers. Silas came to stand beside her. His big hand found hers, calloused fingers threading through her smaller ones. "It looks different." His voice was quiet. Smaller somehow. "It has always been small. That is not what I mean." He turned to look at her. "Before, it was just a place. Now it feels like home." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. She had spent so long being strong, so long holding everything together by sheer will. Now, finally, she could let go. "You know everything about me now." Silas's voice was careful. "What I did, who I was. You still want me to stay?" Clara looked up at him. At this mountain of a man who had saved her life, who had saved her heart. "You had the chance to kill Victor. You did not, because of you." "No." Clara shook her head. "Because of you. Because you are not that man anymore." Silas was quiet for a long moment. Then he dropped to one knee in the mud. Clara blinked. "What are you doing?" "Something I should have done a long time ago." He took both her hands in his. "Clara Whitmore, I do not have much to give you except these hands, but I promise you these hands will build you a home, protect you, love you until the day I die. Silas, will you marry me?" Clara looked at him, at the scar on his jaw, the silver in his dark hair, the storm-gray eyes that had seen too much violence but still knew how to be gentle. "Yes." Her voice broke on the word. "Yes, I will marry you." Silas surged to his feet and kissed her. Hard, deep. A promise and a prayer and a vow all wrapped into one. When they finally broke apart, Jake was standing on the porch, watching them with a grin. "Does this mean Silas is going to be my pa now?" Silas looked at Clara. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Yeah, son." He walked over and scooped the boy up in his arms. "Now I am your pa. 3 months later." The church in Silver Creek was small, but it was full. Maggie O'Brien sat in the front pew, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief she claimed was for allergies. Sheriff Burke stood beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder in a way that suggested some things had changed between them, too. Jeb Rollins was there, looking uncomfortable in a clean shirt and freshly polished boots. He had decided to stay in Silver Creek after all, said he was tired of chasing bounties, said maybe he could build something instead of tearing it down. And at the altar stood Silas Maddox. He was wearing a new suit, the first he had owned in years. It fit his massive frame perfectly, ordered special from Denver. His dark hair was combed back, his face freshly shaved. But his storm-gray eyes were the same as always. Focused. Intense. Fixed on the door at the back of the church. Waiting. The doors opened, and Clara walked in. She was wearing white. A simple dress she had made herself from fabric Silas had bought for her on one of his trips to town. It had tiny flowers embroidered at the collar, and it fit her like it had been made for exactly this moment. Because it had. Jake walked beside her, serving as ring-bearer. He carried a small pillow with two simple gold bands, his face serious with the importance of his duty. Clara reached the altar and took Silas's hands. His massive fingers engulfed hers, warm and strong and gentle. The preacher spoke the words, the vows were exchanged, and when Silas was told he could kiss his bride, he did so with a tenderness that made several of the older ladies reach for their handkerchiefs. Then they walked out of the church, hand in hand, into the bright Colorado sunshine, as husband and wife. That night. The cabin was quiet. Jake was spending the night with Maggie, giving them privacy for their wedding night. Silas stood by the window looking out at the moonlit plains. Clara came up behind him and wrapped her arms around his waist, or as much of it as she could reach. "What are you thinking about?" "About how lucky I am." He turned to face her. "About how I do not deserve any of this. You deserve all of this." Clara reached up to touch his face, and more. He caught her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm. "Now you know." His voice was low. "You have had a man my size. Any regrets?" Clara smiled. "Only that I did not meet you sooner." He kissed her then, soft at first, then deeper still, and when he carried her to the bedroom, she went willingly, joyfully, finally understanding what it meant to be truly loved. Later, as they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, Clara placed Silas's hand on her stomach. "I have something to tell you." Silas went still. "What? You are going to be a father?" She watched his face as the meaning sank in. "Really? You mean—" "Yes." Her smile was trembling now. "I found out last week. I was going to tell you before the wedding, but I wanted to wait until—" Silas pulled her close, so close she could feel the tears on his face. "A family." His voice was rough. "We are going to have a family. We already have a family." Clara kissed his cheek, tasting salt. "We are just adding to it." Silas held her through the night, and when morning came, gray and cold outside the window, he was still there, still holding her, still loving her. Clara Maddox. The new name was strange on her tongue, but it felt right. She looked out the window at the Colorado plains, at the land that was hers, at the home she had built, at the family she had found. The storm had brought him to her, and she would never, not until her dying day, stop being grateful for that howling wind and driving snow. This was her home. This was her family. This was the love she had waited her whole life for without knowing it, and it was worth every storm she had ever weathered. Epilogue. 5 years later. Word count, approximately 500 words. Silas stood on the porch of the ranch house, his coffee growing cold in his hand. The sun was setting over the Colorado plains, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. In the distance, he could see their cattle grazing in the south pasture. Good stock now, healthy, a far cry from the scrawny chickens Clara had been keeping when he first arrived. The house had grown too, 3 additions over 5 years. More bedrooms, a bigger kitchen, a porch that wrapped all the way around. A home. Pa! He turned to see Hope running toward him, her dark hair streaming behind her. She was 4 years old now, with her mother's blue eyes and his stubborn chin. Ma says dinner is almost ready. Tell her I will be right there. Hope ran back inside, her laughter trailing behind her. Silas looked back at the sunset. Thought about the man he used to be. The monster who had done terrible things for terrible people. That man felt like a stranger now. Someone he had read about in a book rather than someone he had been. Lost in thought? He turned to find Clara walking toward him. She was carrying their youngest on her hip, a 2-year-old boy with storm-gray eyes and a grin that could melt ice. Just thinking. About what? About that night, the storm, the knock on your door. Clara came to stand beside him, leaned into his shoulder the way she always did. Best night of my life, she said softly. Mine too. From inside the house, he heard Jake's voice, 17 now and taller every day, helping his siblings set the table. The twins were racing each other to their seats, arguing about who would get to sit next to Pa. Silas Maddox had once been a monster, a drifter, a man without a home. Now he was a husband, a father, a man with more than he had ever dared to dream. And every day, when the storms rolled across the Colorado plains, he still thanked fate for bringing him to the right door at the right time, to the right woman. Ready? Clara asked. Silas looked at his wife, at his children, at the home they had built together from nothing but hope and hard work and love. Yeah, he smiled. I am ready. They walked inside together, closing the door against the cooling evening air. Behind them, the sun sank below the horizon, and the first stars began to appear. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.